Today we're going to be shooting a video on the proper use of the fillet weld gauge and the VWAC gauge for measuring and inspecting welds. So anytime we look at a weld, before we even get to the gauges, the first thing we're going to do is just look it over and say, what do we see? Do we see any spots that are higher than the rest of the weld, that are lower than the rest of the weld? Do I see any undercut, lack of fusion, porosity? I flip it over. Do I have full penetration on the back? Am I missing penetration in any areas? Is my penetration excessive? So you're just going to kind of visually inspect it. Same for the fillet weld. Look at it, what do you see right away? Do you see porosity? Do you see undercut? Is the weld even? Once you look that over and you determine that it's acceptable, or even if it's not, you decide you want to measure the weld, or the weld needs to be measured. For a fillet weld, you're going to use the fillet gauge, and you got to find a gauge that matches the size that you intend to measure. So this material here is 1/8 of an inch. Ideally, it's going to have an 1/8 of an inch weld on it. So first thing I'm going to do is, unless I'm told otherwise, first thing I'm going to do is find my 1/8 inch fillet weld gauge, and it has two sides on it. The side here that looks like a hook is designed to measure flat and convex weld profiles. This side here is designed to measure welds with a concave profile. So what you want to do is you place the gauge into the joint, into the weld, and what you want to see is you want to see the weld contact this corner of the gauge. If it doesn't contact that corner of the gauge, then that's not the size of the weld. It'd be smaller than that. If it exceeds that point on the gauge, then you're going to move up to your next size, which would be 3/16. So if it touches on 3/16, then it's a 3/16 of an inch weld. If it doesn't touch, but it was larger than an 1/8, we're still going to consider it an 1/8 of an inch weld. So you got to have that point of contact right there. So not only do you measure it this way and look for the point of contact, you also need to flip the gauge around and measure it this way, because you're measuring the legs, and every weld has two legs on it. So you want to see it touch that corner. If it doesn't touch that corner, it doesn't meet that size. For a concave weld, you're just looking to see if it touches in the center, if the throat of the weld touches this part of the gauge, here again, right on the corner. If it touches it, then it meets that size. If it doesn't touch it, then it's not that size. So that's kind of how you use the fillet weld gauges. They also have a line on them, so you don't have to measure it this way and also measure it this way, a cheater line. I'm not a big fan of the cheater line. If the weld is obviously smaller or larger than your dimension, it's one thing, but if it's close, you definitely want to measure the other direction on the weld. So that's kind of how you use the fillet weld gauge. This gauge right here is called a VWAC gauge. It has a lot of different uses. We can use it to measure undercut. We can use it to measure reinforcement on a weld. We can use it to measure if a weld is underfilled, where the joint is not totally filled in. And it also has holes in it that can measure 1/8 inch porosity and 1/16 of an inch porosity. So if we have porosity in the weld and we're trying to add it up to meet our specified criteria, whether or not it's acceptable, we can kind of use these to measure them out and say, that's greater than a 1/16, it's greater than an 1/8. It would be unacceptable, or it would be acceptable depending on the code. So to use the VWAC gauge, what you're going to do is, like I say, first of all, look at the weld. And on these welds here, we're looking to see that the reinforcement is an 1/8 of an inch or less. So try to find a high spot in the weld. Push the gauge, push this end of the gauge down, and you're going to place the gauge flat on the steel, and then you're just going to bring the gauge down until it touches the weld. You don't need to crank it down, because the more you push on it, the more it wants to rise up on you. Just so it touches the weld, and then you're going to look at your scale over here and determine what your measurement is. This weld here has just over a 1/16 of an inch reinforcement. Each mark on this scale represents a 1/64 of an inch. And then we've also got a 1/16 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 and a quarter marked out on here. So as long as it's less than an 1/8 of an inch, we're okay. Now if the weld was underfilled, where it was caved in, then you would use the other side, the upper part, and that would be a negative number. So whenever we're measuring reinforcement, we want to be at least at 0. If we're below 0, it's no good. They're not acceptable. For measuring undercut, it's the same thing. You know, you look at your weld and you say, oh, I've got a little undercut on it. All right, here's a little undercut. Put the gauge in there and determine how deep your undercut is. Normally it's going to be about a 32nd of an inch is what you're allowed. For us, it's a 32nd of an inch. So as long as you're less than a 32nd of an inch, you're okay on your undercut. This one here would be acceptable. You can also use it, like I say, to measure reinforcement on the root. This weld here does not have complete root penetration, but if you want to just make sure, if it's tough to tell in an area, put the gauge on there and measure it out and say, oh, nope, it's not flush there. If it's not flush, it's not acceptable. And here again on the root, it's up to 1/8 of an inch as well, so you can have it protrude 1/8 of an inch. That's just a quick orientation on how to use the VWAC gauge and the fillet weld gauge.